Good evening, everyone. I'm Ajamu Baraka, and I'm joining you again for The Voice from the Margins here in 2017. It's been a couple of weeks now, and we've had a bit of a break, but now we are back for serious business here in 2017. As you might also notice, we are starting at a new time. Instead of 9, we will be doing this every Thursday at 8 o'clock. And we hope to have some very important and timely conversations with all of you out there. On a personal note, many have asked, I had a chance, I think, for a couple of days at least, during the holidays to try to finally kind of decompress, if you will, from the campaign. You know, we went right from the campaign to all kinds of activities and really didn't get a chance to get some rest. But I got a couple of days, so I'm feeling much better. This year, I'm prepared to jump right back into the fight, and a fight we really are involved in, one that we have to be prepared to engage in, and in fact to win. Before we get into our conversation, we have a very important guest with us this evening, Eva Bartlett, who is a fantastic people's journalist who is going to share with us some of her observations, her experiences in covering what tonight and covering Syria. She's been involved in all kinds of activities globally. But before we get into that, though, let's just remind ourselves that here in 2017, we have a lot of stuff happening, a lot of things happening this week that the Green Party and the campaign is involved in particular, Occupy the inauguration, activities that the campaign and Green Party will be involved in. So please check out Jill's Facebook and be looking out for the announcements. Jill and I will be doing some activities. We'll be together in Washington in February at the Institute of Policy Studies to talk about the future of third-party political work here in the U.S. So look out for that information also. So let's jump right into it. We are a few minutes late, had some technical problems. So let's go right to the conversation so that we can then open up the lines for the conversation with all of you. Eva, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Are you still there?
I am still here, and it's nice to see you again, Ajamu. I think the last time was well over a year ago.
Yes, and we were in Lebanon at that moment.
Yes.
So thank you so much for joining me this evening. Briefly say a little bit about yourself, and then then we'll have our conversation. What brought you to this work, and what have you been doing for the last year?
Yeah, Ajamu, I'm actually glad the way you phrased it, a people's journalist, because that's really the approach I take. Like I try to be as factual as possible, but I really want to convey the voices we're not hearing. And with regard to Syria, in terms of corporate media, we're not hearing the Syrian voices. We're hearing all these slick, well-funded campaigns that claim to be the Syrian voices. But if you actually go to Syria, what you hear on the ground is very different than what Al Jazeera or Channel 4 or Fox or CNN or Democracy Now! Or any of these both corporate and so-called independent media tell us is happening in Syria. So since April 2014, I've gone to Syria 6 times. Twice with delegations, and the other 4 times I've applied for, paid for, waited for a journalist visa, and then gone on my own by shared taxi from Beirut to Damascus. And this past summer, I actually, applying for the visa and then extending the visa, I was able to stay in Syria for a couple of months and travel extensively in areas, obviously I wasn't in areas occupied by ISIS or others in, of Al-Qaeda nature, but I was in many key areas that, people, I think they would want to know, hear what the Syrians there are saying. Homs, which I'd been to in April and June 2014 and December 2015, and Aleppo. I went to Aleppo 4 times, twice this summer and then twice when I went back in November this year. November, October, I was there for about 1 month collectively. So, I had a lot of opportunity, especially with regard to Aleppo, to get a sense of the hell that they were living under the reign of these different militant factions, and a sense of, what they were hoping for. And we'll probably get into that, but, what they were hoping for was an end to the, as they say, terrorism. On a daily basis, they were being bombarded by these different militant factions.
Before we get into that, though, Eva, let's make sure that we sort of lay the ground. So Aleppo was divided into two. Talk about that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point too. That's something, the division of Aleppo was something that most Aleppo Syrians rejected. And this is a theme throughout Syria. They reject any sort of division or sectarianism. It's been foisted upon them from outside, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, and of course the NATO alliance. But within Aleppo, so there was geographically more or less a division, in the sense that in mid-2012, different militant factions occupied areas of eastern areas of Aleppo, also northern and southern areas. But it became known, simplified in the corporate media as East and West Aleppo. Now, an important point about that is, in general, when corporate media and Western leaders talked about Aleppo, they were talking solely and exclusively about the eastern areas. They weren't talking about the greater Aleppo, which comprised at least 1.5 million people. One other point to note is that even the United Nations, and this doesn't really come as a surprise if you're following the war on Syria, even the United Nations grossly exaggerated the number of people in eastern Aleppo. For years, they've said, we know that there are 270,000 civilians in eastern Aleppo. Now, in December, all of Aleppo was secured by the Syrian army and allies, and at most, if we're going to be generous, 130,000, maybe 140,000 people came out of those areas. So it's still, even if you want to be generous and say 150,000, you're still short 120,000 people. Where are they? And this is an important point, because when you inflate the numbers, that means there's many more people that, concerned people in the West are caring about, because that's the whole thing. Anyway, the West, greater Aleppo, one other point I think people should know is that, for the past year, we've heard about the siege of eastern Aleppo, the military siege on militant factions in eastern Aleppo. What was never highlighted was the many attempts by the Syrian army and the Russians to enable citizens to evacuate from eastern Aleppo. And I personally went to one of the humanitarian crossings that was shelled twice while I was there, at very close proximity. So I'm lucky I'm here today.
Yeah, Eva, one of the things that we noticed when the eastern Aleppo was in fact taken control of by the Syrian army was that for those of us who are exposed to the alternative press, what was interesting was that many of the stories that we heard from people who were trapped in East Aleppo were that in fact they were made aware of the humanitarian corridors that they were supposed to be able to take advantage of and leave. But the stories seem to be consistent that they were unable to leave because of the activities of the militants there in East Aleppo. And so it seems like there was this clash of narratives. And one of the things that we wanted to talk about this evening was, we know that there's information that's circulating, and we see that this information seems to be sort of consumed by people in the West and in the U.S. Uncritical in terms of its sources. Where was the information coming from out of Aleppo specifically in terms of what was really happening on the ground?
Well, that's a really good point that many people don't think to ask, because they get it, uncritically thinking, or for lack of time or whatever, from our media sources, proclaiming these are the facts. But who are the sources? I just want to make one quick note also. When I was in Aleppo in November on my 4th trip there, I did interview 2 different families that said exactly what you said. They had tried to flee prior. They tried to escape the militant factions, and they'd been violently prevented. One family twice, another family 4 times. So they wanted to leave. They wanted to go to the government areas, but they couldn't get out. Most of the sources that our media has been relying on have been anyone from the White Helmets, which are portrayed as rescuers and neutral, and yet they're portrayed as a grassroots groups of Syrians that are just trying to do their bit for the community. But in fact, they're funded by well over $100 million from the West, UK, US, EU, etc. And they're not neutral. They're only in al-Nusra areas, and many of them you can find them holding weapons. You can find the same white helmet person in another photo on their Facebook profiles or other social media holding weapons and participating with militant groups. And you can find them also standing on dead Syrian soldiers' bodies. So they're by no means neutral, but they have been a key source of this misinformation. Channels like the UK Channel 4, which also had its own reporters like Bilal Abdul Karim, a so-called independent journalist that was embedded with Nusra and, Nuruddin al-Zinki and other terrorist groups and praising them essentially. And another group called the Aleppo Media Center, AMC. You'll see the logo on many of the videos that were supposedly coming out of Aleppo. And this group is also funded by France, the UK, etc. Another source of information, and this is, one of the most astounding sources of information, was a 7-year-old child named Bana Al-Abid. And we were led to believe that Bana, whose Twitter account began in September of last year, and which blossomed to, tens of thousands of followers immediately, we're led to believe that this 7-year-old kid was tweeting phrases like, end the genocide, we want a no-fly zone, very NATO alliance phrases. Later it came out, well, no, her mother was helping her with it. Turns out Bana's father was one of the militants. So again, not an impartial source. And just in my own personal, having been to Aleppo 4 times, every time I went to Aleppo, and this is in government secured Aleppo, granted they didn't have electricity, they were surviving on generators in government secured Aleppo, but every time I went, it was a struggle to open my email, let alone to tweet something. And Bana sometimes was tweeting 10, 20 more times a day from eastern Aleppo. So she was one of the sources we were being told, and other activists that said they were in Aleppo, but we're basically told to believe unnamed activists and the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is based in the UK and has no actual people on the ground. And even, none of the international institutions had people on the ground in Aleppo. They all relied on so-called unnamed activists.
Okay. Eva, let's go ahead and move on to the Q&A portion of our show.
Sure.
This is where we allow and encourage our activists to pose questions, and we have a number of questions that are in fact beginning to come in. And this will give you a chance to elaborate on some of the points that you've been making so far. So let's move to that. See. Dave asked the question, what is your view of the Obama administration supporting the rebels in Syria? Does this shift the balance of power away from the despotic regime to the even more despotic force of ISIS? Do you see any flaws in this strategy? Eva?
Yeah, where to begin? I would encourage listeners or viewers to look at the report of a German journalist, I forget his name offhand, but a few months ago, he, Toddenheimer or something like that, he interviewed a top al-Nusra, al-Qaeda commander, who essentially said, yes, we get weapons from the U.S. This is al-Nusra. This is not moderate rebels. He said, we get the weapons, whether it's TOW missiles or whatever else he's talking about, from the U.S. And, he said he wanted more. The whole notion that the U.S. is training rebels is completely a farce by now. And by the way, the U.S.-led coalition has accidentally airdropped supplies to ISIS themselves on many occasions. And in September, the U.S.-led coalition attacked a Syrian army base for nearly 1 hour. They killed at least 80 Syrian soldiers. They knew it was a Syrian army base, and ISIS took over the base right away.
So you're saying that basically you're suggesting that the U.S. is directly involved in funding these forces, even though they know that these elements are either directly tied to Al-Qaeda and ISIS, or in fact, in many cases, are in fact Al-Qaeda. And if that's the case, why isn't that being more widely discussed in the U.S.?
Well, I mean, it has been discussed. I think even the New York Times made reference to a 2012 DIA, which is Defense Intelligence Agency declassified document, which itself noted that the U.S. supported the rise of so-called Islamic extremists. And we know that ISIS are not really Islamic extremists. They're a mercenary group that are operating in the name of extreme Islam. But they, of course, don't represent Islam. But anyway, the point being that the U.S. in their own internal documents were saying if the rise of this, extremist Islamist were to occur in Syria, essentially it would be a good thing. It would be a way to topple the government. It would be something they would support. I personally haven't read the whole bit about the Clinton emails, but I know there's some pretty damning evidence in that. Seymour Hersh is an investigative journalist, and I don't know his history, but I do believe he used to be published in the New Yorker or other mainstream publications. But since he started critically writing about Syria, perhaps Libya, but certainly Syria, he's published in the London Review of Books, the LRB, and he's done some also damning investigative work showing the trail of weapons from Libya through Turkey to so-called rebels in Syria. And, he's spoken about that which is not spoken of on CNN, Fox News, etc. So it's not being talked about because this agenda, the U.S. supporting, opposition, what they call opposition, has been in effect since prior to 2011. And
well, let me ask this.
Go ahead.
Let me follow up. There's a question that Pat has that is related to what you just said, and that is that if in fact the U.S., France, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey have been directly involved in funding, arming, supporting groups that have been identified as being part of this international terrorist network, and Al Qaeda specifically. Why isn't there some move by the International Criminal Court or other entities to bring these states and the leaders of these states to justice?
I can't really speak to the ICC, but let's take the UN as an example because it's supposed to be, the universal. It's supposed to be the body that prevents genocides and prevents war crimes, or at least documents, or brings peace. The United Nations itself is aware that Israel is treating terrorists in hospitals, in Israeli hospitals, and funneling them back into Syria. They're aware of this because the United Nations has observer forces in the occupied Syrian Golan. And the observer forces have documented both the flow of militants from Israel into the occupied Syrian Golan, and also the back and forth of militants being sent to Israel, being treated in hospitals. This has been documented even by Sky News or one of the UK channels. But the point being, the observer forces have documented this interaction between Israeli soldiers and militants in Syria. And, obviously this is a point of extreme alarm, but nothing happens with it in the UN. UN has been a platform wherein it actively works to silence the Syrian voice, and it enables the voices of the powers that are actually effectively warring on and supporting militants in Syria to have the voice at the UN. Saudi Arabia is head of the UN Human Rights Council. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the EU, the UK. When the Syrian ambassador at the UN gets up to speak, the rest of the parties walk out. And even there's a technical point I have to mention, and that is that at the United Nations, every government is to be called by its name. So it's the Syrian Arab Republic or the government of Syria. And yet the UN allows, even though the Syrian ambassador to the UN has, politely demanded that this not occur, the UN allows people to call it the Syrian regime. This is not technically or legally correct. So there are many blatant violations by the UN, and there are many nuances. But the fact is that, I don't fully believe in, definitely not in the United Nations. I can't speak to the ICC. I don't know enough about it.
Okay. Now, even when you were traveling around the country, and specifically these last couple of visits, Tim wants to know if you were under the direct supervision of Assad government, quote unquote, handlers.
Okay, I know I get that question a lot. Damascus is a city that has a lot of military checkpoints, and the reason being there have been, and there continue to be in other cities, car bombs, etc. So you can't go very far in Damascus without coming across a military checkpoint. That's to say, in Damascus, it's easier for me to walk alone, and I do it all the time, nobody with me, and I encounter people and I talk with people. In other cities, there are different security risks, so it's less easy for me to be alone. That said, any human being can tell when somebody is lying to you, or when you feel like they're being forced in what they're saying. The interactions I had in Aleppo, in fact, the last time I was there, I was with an Aleppo journalist and not with anybody from the Ministry of Information. And I was interacting with Syrians one-on-one. And I speak Arabic too, moderate colloquial Arabic. So I was interacting with them one-on-one without any so-called handlers present. There have been times when there have been people from the Ministry of Information with me, but I still maintain that, I go to the Aleppo Medical Association and I talk with the doctors there. They have no reason to lie or distort the truth. I ask them numbers and they tell me the numbers. I ask for information, they tell me the information. The things I was witnessing in Aleppo had not only to do with the testimonies of people, and the testimonies I took of the IDPs from Eastern Aleppo were with a journalist and not with any sort of ministry person. But the things I was witnessing, the bombing I was witnessing in Aleppo from the militant factions, or the people that I was seeing being injured at the hospital, coming into the hospital, it doesn't matter if there is a ministry person there or not. But I get the implication. The implication is that people can't speak freely, but I totally disagree with that. And incidentally, I actually traveled to Aleppo on my own in a taxi, just me and the driver, on my last visit.
We were getting a lot of information about the so-called barrel bombs and all of that the Syrian government allegedly drops in eastern Aleppo. But we saw very little information regarding what some news outlets talked about or described as the indiscriminate fire coming from East Aleppo into government-held Western Aleppo. Did you see evidence of that, or were you able to experience that directly in terms of those kind of activities?
On various different occasions I did. On my very first visit in July of this year, there was some sort of explosion. I can't say if it was a gas canister bomb, a water heater bomb, or conventional Grad missile supplied, from Turkey. But it was within probably 500 meters of where I was. An explosive bullet landed about 15 meters away. It had exploded in the air, so by the time it landed, it didn't, cause an explosion. But it was very close to some parked cars, so if it had landed on them, I wouldn't be here. On November 3rd, I was there in Aleppo on a day when there were 18 civilians killed and over 200 wounded by a variety of Grad missiles and then these improvised, gas canister and water heater bombs. So, and I was at one of the main hospitals and seeing the victims as they came in. So I have had, experience with that. And believe me, it's something people in Aleppo, whoever I was speaking with, would tell me, why doesn't anybody speak about this? Why aren't they talking about our daily suffering? On a daily basis, we're being attacked.
Did you happen to see many journalists from the West as you moved around the country?
I did, in fact, on one occasion on my first visit in April 2014, I saw Lise Doucet, who's a Canadian but works with the BBC. And it's a very notable point that where I saw her, and that was the French hospital in Damascus. And I'd gone there with a few others on this international peace delegation I went with on my very first visit. And the reason we went to the French hospital is that militants in Jobar or east of Damascus had been shelling the city. And in 2014 and 2015, on all my visits there, I stayed in the old city and I was in the thick of the shelling. It was going on all around me, very close to me. So in this instance, we went to the hospital to see who the victims were, and they were like over 60 children had been injured and one had been killed when one of these mortars hit a school, the Al-Manar school in Damascus. And Lise Doucet was there. And so there was an interaction with her and somebody else asking her, is she going to tell the truth? And I later saw a report in which she, I can't remember it offhand, she didn't tell the full truth. She said there was a kid injured or kids injured, and she implied that it was unknown where the mortar had come from. And that's clearly not true. It was very easy to deduce that it came only from the militant occupied areas. In November, I was with a group of journalists in Aleppo. And so, New York Times, LA Times, I'm not sure what other publications, BBC. And I know that the New York Times person, Anne Bernard, did not tell the whole truth. She had to qualify the November 3rd, 18 dead, 200 injured with some alleged attacks. And the source of information was the Syrian Observatory in the UK. So.
Eva, Primala would like to know, what is in fact the interest of the agenda of the West and NATO in Syria?
I have heard different analyses of this. I think there's more than one. One of the primary ones is securing the area in terms of resources. Who controls the area controls the resources, and therefore keeps other countries like Russia or China from having those resources. That's one theory I've heard. Another is to do with pipelines. It's the same idea, essentially, pipelines going through the country. So whether it's a pipeline, a Qatar-Israeli pipeline going through Syria to Turkey, or whether it's one that has Syria's interests, that's one other reason I've heard. Another has been because Syria has been historically one of the strongest supporters of Palestine, and Palestinians in Syria have equal rights as Syrian citizens and live like Syrian citizens. But I think also mainly the support they've given to Palestine and Palestinian resistance is another factor in terms of like breaking up the countries that have an alliance, whether it's Syria, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba. There's many countries that people aren't aware of that have been involved in Syria, but in other ways, like sending medical aid to Syria, defying the criminal Western sanctions on Syria. But I mean, the prime reasons have nothing to do, absolutely nothing to do with democracy or human rights. That I can attest to.
Eva, people are trying to, figure out for themselves what's really happening in that country. We get bombarded with so many different perspectives and narratives. Most of them seem to be consistent, though, but the information is so confusing for many people who are not following that situation that closely and not aware of the politics of the region. So Suzanne wants to know, based on your understanding, based on your interaction with the people in that country, what do the people of Syria, what do they really want there? And then let's connect that to the question that Noel has that says, what should the U.S. do or not do there in Syria?
Nice. Yeah. Overwhelmingly, the people I've spoken with have said, we want an end to, and they call it terrorism. We want an end to the terrorism. We want the West, the U.S. and the other allied nations to stop funding terrorists. We want Turkey to close its borders and stop allowing terrorists to come and go and enter Syria and attack our people. Many, if not most people have said, we want Syria to be how it was prior to 2011, because then it was a developing nation in the Middle East. It was one of the safest in that region, and people could afford to live. The combination of the war on Syria and the sanctions means that people can't afford to live now. So people want an end to the terrorism, and they want people to hear their voices, and they want people to butt out and not come in and tell Syria, you can't choose your own leader. You have to accept Western intervention. Syrians are not stupid, they've seen what's happened to Iraq and Libya. They're well aware that if, the US imposes one of their Western Syrian elites as government, or if these Wahhabi, Takfiri mercenaries get their way and take over areas of Syria, this is not going to give them, peace, stability, human rights. Women won't have freedom. There's so many things that the Western narrative on Syria is just so wrong on every level, and what they claim to be rebels, whether they're Free Syrian Army or Nusra or ISIS, they're all committing these heinous crimes against the Syrian people.
So what should people in the U.S. support in terms of U.S. policy toward Syria? What should the U.S. do in Syria or not do?
I would direct people to the website handsoffsyriacoalition.net, because this is a coalition of various different anti-war, anti-imperialist groups, coming at it from different angles, but their essential points of unity are stop interfering in Syria, stop sending terrorists to Syria, respect Syrians' sovereign right to choose their government, and lift the sanctions on Syria. These are the essentials. Again, the Syrian representatives and people themselves maintain, if the borders are closed, if terrorists are no longer flowing in from Turkey or, flowing across the desert from Iraq into Syria, and the U.S.-led coalition does nothing to stop them. And this has happened. This is how Palmyra was taken over. If the borders were secured and if the West stopped financing terrorism, then there would be an end. Then the Syrians could fight the terrorists that are there within, or the people that are of Syrian origin, because we have to remember there are terrorists from over 100 countries fighting in Syria in the name of democracy and human rights. But within, with the Syrians who have taken up arms, thousands have laid down their arms and taken amnesty and returned to Syrian civil society or joined the Syrian army in fighting against terrorists.
Eva, we have about a minute left. In that last minute, can you speak to how you see the U.S. policy either remaining consistent or changing under the new Trump administration that's coming into power in January?
I actually can't. I'm not. I've been out of Canada. I've been out of North America, and I don't know enough about the new U.S. administration. I've been incredibly busy, so I can't really speak to that. All I can say is that I hope that this administration decides not to support terrorism in Syria and other countries. I hope that the administration would. This is being hopeful, but I think above all, any U.S. administration should start caring about the people and stop funding these wars all around the world. Care about your own infrastructure and your own health care. So, but as far as Trump, I don't know enough. But I'd really like to encourage people to look at the work of a number of people that were in Aleppo. So people that were there when it was liberated. You can hear heartbreaking but genuine testimonies and realities from on the ground. Vanessa Beeley is one. Jan Oberg is another. Andrew Ashdown is another. And Tom Duggan is in Syria. I really would encourage people to look at these. I mean, if not Syrians, of course, themselves.
And how would they get that information, Eva?
Yeah, all those people are on Facebook. So, Vanessa Beeley, Jan Oberg, Oberg, Andrew Ashdown, as it sounds, and Tom Duggan, Duggan. They're all on Facebook, and then you can find some of them, like Vanessa writes for 21st Century Wire.
Okay.
Yeah.
Eva, I want to really thank you for joining us this evening. It's been very, very informative. We have had a lot of questions. We only got through a few of those, but I think that you provided a different perspective, something that people can weigh as they try to figure out what's happening in that country and be better prepared to determine for themselves what kind of position they should take vis-a-vis the U.S. government in terms of its policies in that country. So thank you so much.
Thank you
for joining us. Thank all of you for sending in your questions. I encourage you to follow up and try to get in contact with those folks to give yourself another perspective on what's happening in that country. It is vitally important that we are educated on this situation in Syria because of how deeply implicated the U.S. government and its allies are with this situation. So thanks a lot, everybody, and join us next week at 8 o'clock now for another conversation from A Voice from the Margin. Thank you so much.
Thank you.